we're going to try and just investigate a little bit about what is the mitzvah of lechem mishnah, right? Of having two separate loaves of bread that we cut into at each of the meals over Shabbos. So just to sort of set the stage and get some sources, so the pasuk in Shemos says, and this is about the man, right? So it says, "Vayhi bayom hashishi laktu lechem mishnah shnei haomer leechad." Right. So it was on Fridays they could gather together the lechem mishnah. That's where the term comes from. It's actually from the pasuk shnei haomer. So that's like the size. The I think that's a weighted amount. I think so. Each person got two omer. So that's where we learn out lechem mishnah. That's the pasuk. Now, in terms of the man, right, the man that fell, and the Gemara in Shabbos says, Rabbi Abba, Shabbos chayiv adam nivtsoa al shtei karos dichsiv lechem mishnah. So we have a Gemara that states that we have a chiyuv to cut into two loaves, as it says lechem mishnah, and Rashi says livtsoa, meaning berchas hamotzi, meaning that it sounds like that the mitzvah lechem mishnah is connected into the bracha that we make when we say hamotzi. So this is what we have to sort of try to understand a little bit more. So the first question that we might want to ask is this mitzvah a deraisa or is it drabanan? So the Shulchan Aruch says, and this is talking about. So this is a little bit of a connection to Hanukkah coming up. Not really, but it does connect. So Shulchan Aruch over by in Hilchas Hanukkah. So this siman is all about that the idea of Ner Shabbos comes before Ner Hanukkah. It's only one sif. It says Misha ein yado masegas liknos Ner Hanukkah v'Ner Shabbos. Somebody who cannot afford to purchase both Ner for Hanukkah and Ner for Shabbos. Yikne Ner Shabbos mipnei shalom beso. You go after, you purchase Ner Shabbos, more important because it represents shalom bayis. V'im yishlo l'shir Shabbos ve'ein lo Ner Hanukkah le'yayin le'kiddush hayom yikne Ner Hanukkah mipnei persumin nisa. But if you have for Shabbos, but you don't have Ner for Hanukkah, and you have yayin for kiddush, for the day at least, yikna le'ner Hanukkah, because then Ner Hanukkah, the importance of that is that it's presuming Nisa. Okay, we're not going to get too far into this, but there's a really important taz. The Turi Zahav on this sif says something very interesting. He says, Kasav Aran Beis Yosef Afal Gavda Kiddush Deraisa. So we know that making kiddush, and maybe we'll look at this on a separate occasion, but we know that making kiddush is a deraisa, at least by night. The Ner Hanukkah is drabanan. Even the efshar lekadesh al hapas, lekadesh al hapas. Shemin, so shemin l'Ner Hanukkah adif. So. Okay, so even though Kiddush is deraisa, Ner Hanukkah is drabanan, right? The whole holiday of Hanukkah is rabbinic, because you can make Kiddush on bread. Therefore, the shemen, right, the ner of Hanukkah becomes adif over the yayin. So adkan. Well, the Taz says, im eno pas. Pas adif, but if you don't have bread, then the bread becomes more important than the Ner Hanukkah. Shetzurich lekadesh alav midaraisa, because you have to make kiddush on something, whether it's yayin or pas or bread. So therefore, that becomes more important. Of Aharambam Kosev Kan the Ner Hanukkah v'kiddush hayom shneim midivrei sofrim. V'Ner Hanukkah adif mikiddush hayom mishum pirsum neis v'imkein afilu ein lo pas. Okay. He's talking about just what about during the day. That's a little bit different because Kiddush during the day on Shabbos is drabanan, Ner Hanukkah is drabanan. So then he starts to talk about what about that. What we want to get into is, so then he says, okay, sorry, just wanted to get to where we want to actually see where this fits into our sugya. So he says, so here the Taz says something very interesting. He says, and he's quoting our Gemara that we saw up above, that Rabbi Abba says that you have to have lechem mishnah. And he says that over there, that lechem mishnah and the shlosh seudos gamkein de'araisa. Very interesting, right? Lechem mishnah becomes de'araisa according to the Taz. Upas ba'inin kedeisa b'simin reish ayin dalid. And he's saying, so if you're going to tell me that lechem mishnah is de'araisa and pas is required, so that's the equation that he's going with over Ner Chanukah. Not so concerned about that part of the equation with Ner Chanukah, but the fact that he's telling us that lechem mishnah is deraisa is truly, something that is unique according to the Taz. Okay, so that's the piece I wanted to bring in. It's a Taz that we have to try and figure out why he holds that lechem mishnah is deraisa. Because if we look back at the pasuk doesn't seem to be telling us that we have to take lechem mishnah today. There's no like tzivui in here. There's no commandment language, and there's no language of commandment in here. It seems to be more like telling us the story that every Friday in the midbar they could gather the shnei haomer, the double portion of man. So we have to try to understand this Torah zahav. Okay. We're going to leave that for a moment, but we'll come back to it. Okay. So there's another Shulchan Aruch that says Chodesh Acha b'Yom Kippurim. So this is an interesting, and this is what we're going to look at is the Magen Avram. So the Magen Avram, another of the Achronim who comment on the Shulchan Aruch. So we have the Taz on the one hand. Now we're going to look at the Magen Avram. And last time we looked at Ner Chanukah, now we're going to look at Yom Kippurim. So we're really sort of doing a whole tour of holidays today. But it says that Achol she'acha b'Yom Kippurim v'nisyashev data be'inyan sheyachol levarich tzurich lahazker shel Yom Kippurim b'berchas hamazon. So what Shulchan Aruch is saying is, what happens if you're really not feeling well on Yom Kippurim to the point where you need to eat? Right, so there it becomes a necessity for you to eat. You no longer have the obligation to fast, so now you're eating. But let's say after you finish your meal, you actually feel well enough that you can say Berchas Hamazon, right? So if that's the case, then in your Berchas Hamazon you have to say Ya'aleh V'yavo. Right? It's an interesting thing. Sometimes I've seen one or two benchers around that actually have the insert in Ya'aleh V'yavo for Yom Kippurim, and you sort of like look at it and you laugh. But that's what this is. This is what that is based on. Is that there's an actual halach in Shulchan Aruch that says that if you do have to eat, children too would be in this child who's eating but knows how to bench would say Ya'aleh V'yavo. Okay, so there's a Magen Avraham over there. It says Chodesh Achal. So if you are eating on Yom Kippurim, ubotzeya al shtei kikaros, he says, then you should also, if you're going to do this, you should be cutting into lechem mishnah. V'linir de'ein she'ein tzarich delo tiknu kain b'Yom Kippurim. And this is really the only piece that we need. So you would think, he says, that we should be cutting into lechem mishnah, but then he says, but I don't think so. Why? Delo tiknu kain b'Yom Kippurim. So it sounds like from what he's saying is that really this is just a takana of drabanan. This is not a right. This is not a deraisa because you're talking about a takana. Okay. I think there's one more piece in here, though. Yeah, why don't we leave it there? But so it sounds like from the Magen Avram that this is a Takanos D'Rabbanan. So we have the Taz on the one hand saying it's D'Oraisa, and you have the Magen Avram that seems to be saying that it is simply a Takana D'Rabbanan, and it's not at the D'Oraisa level. So again, we have to try and figure out excuse me, what exactly is this chiyuv, this mitzvah of lechem mishnah. Okay, so we have one more source that of another Magen Avraham, who says over here on the Shulchan Aruch says b'tanum shalanu she'ein behem rediyah. So this is talking about Hilchos Shabbos. So now we're back into Shabbos. So he says muter lahotzi yoser mishlosh seudas b'sakin or b'shum davar sheyisachov bo mikol makom lo yotzi beresach mishum nemexik uvdim dechol. He says the Shulchan Aruch says that in our ovens, you are allowed to, let's say there was bread that sort of, the way that he describes it almost sounds like those, where they used to take the bread in this type of oven and it's almost like stick it to the side of the oven. It sort of like would cook that way, and then you'd sort of grab it down. I don't know if you've seen these types of things, but I think they still use them maybe in India and other places. And he says that, you have it, it's still left up in there over Shabbos, and you don't have, you don't have lechem mishnah. You are allowed to take it down out of the oven on Shabbos, but you should don't use the specific, tool, the specific implement that they would use during the week, because that makes it look like, you're doing something that is, for the weekday and not for Shabbos. So just use some other implement, but you're allowed to take it down. So Magen Avraham says, "Midi dahavi al gabe gecholim, k'moshe kasav siman hey v'mayri behidbig beheter k'moshe kasav sham." Okay, so this is talking about, he's describing what it is, that it's on top of the coals, that it's inside the side of this oven, but it's there. It's put up there beheter, meaning that what the Magen Avraham is telling us is that he's describing the situation in that you're not doing anything in terms of like bishul or anything else when you're taking down this loaf of bread. There's no problem there. So he says, sorry, there it is. I underlined it. I knew this was a big piece, and we should just take a look at the end. So he says mikol makom, just sort of skipping all the way to the bottom here. It says mikol makom eina chova kol kach. So this is talking about the lechem mishnah, the fact that you're taking this down to be used as lechem mishnah. He says mikol makom eina chova kol kach. And you can see that a different place. But what is interesting here is that on the last piece by the Magen Avraham, we saw that it was a takana, that he said that we weren't matakin, or the rabbis weren't matakin on Yom Kippur. Here he's saying that it's not such a great chov, even on Shabbos, to have lechem mishnah. So now it sort of makes you wonder, what is this? Is it a takana d'Rabbanan? Is it even less than a takana? Like, what does that mean? Because when you say ein chova kol kach, that means that it's like not such quite the requirement to have lechem mishnah. So we're really sort of stuck between two extremes. On the one hand, the Taz made it sound like it's deraisa. On the other hand, you have the Magen Avraham, who's making it sound like the chiyuv isn't even all that stringent in the first place by the rabbinically. So we've got to try and figure out what the nature is. So, but at this point, what we're going to do is shift gears a little bit and ask the question a little bit differently. What exactly is the mitzvah of lechem mishnah? Is it a mitzvah in the bracha? Is it a requirement of when you slice into the bread? Is it something about the seuda? What exactly is lechem mishnah, and what part of the whole meal is it incumbent upon? Okay, so let's take a look at let's take a look at the Shulchan Aruch Harav. So this was the first Lubavitcher Rebbe, right? The Baal HaTanya. He also wrote a halachic sefer called the Shulchan Aruch Harav, which is quoted quite often. We're going to see there's a Chai Adam who says very similarly. We don't need to see both of them. We'll start with just the Shulchan Aruch Harav, but it's going to give us an indication like what exactly is the essence of lechem mishnah. So he says, Ein hamisubim reshayim litom ad sheyitom habotzeya. So when you're making hamotzi, the person who's making hamotzi at the table has to eat first before any of the people who are there can eat, right? So when they're passing out the slices of challah, you wait until the person who made the bracha eats, then you can eat, right? That's what he's saying. So imheim zakukim lakikaro, but he says that now there are different situations, right? I don't know if you've ever been. Sometimes I think at most of our tables we usually just have the head of the household is making hamotzi on 2 loaves of bread, right? But there are different minhagim, and sometimes you'll see that each person at his own place or her own place will actually have 2 challah rolls. I mean, usually not a whole loaf, but maybe a challah roll, right? Two small kikaros, loaves of bread. So if they don't have that, then you have to wait until the person who made the bracha to eat, or the person, it says actually the person cutting into it has eaten before you can eat. Because in this instance, not everybody has lechem mishnah in front of them. So because of that, they have to wait until the botzeh, the person cutting into it, eats first. So it's still the person, you only have one person making a bracha, but the question is, do you have lechem mishnah in front of you or do you not? If you don't, you have to wait until you get your slice, but you have to wait until that person has eaten. If you have lechem mishnah in front of you, then you can go ahead and eat. So it sounds like from the Shulchan Aruch Harav that the idea of lechem mishnah is you have to be able to cut into lechem mishnah. You have to have 2 loaves in front of you as you're cutting in order to be yotzei lechem mishnah. And then the Chai Adam says something similarly, that it seems to be within the cutting of it, the betzia, being a botzeya.
But you only have to cut into one of the 2.
That's a good question. So there are different minhagim. We're going to go with that you only have to cut into one. There are those who cut into both. But yeah, that's a good question. Really a separate, but we're not going to get into that. But yes, that's definitely a good question. Okay. So what I want to do, trying to decide here. I think what we'll do is we'll skip this Tosfos for a moment. And we're going to look at the Minchas Asher. So this is Rav Asher Weiss in Israel. So he writes and he says, "V'lechara hava mina de'ein ha-mitzvah etzem ha-betzia ela kvias ha-seuda al lechem mishnah v'ha'achila mimenu." He says, it appears to me that even though what we just saw in the Shulchan Aruch Harav, we didn't see it, but the Chai Adam says the same thing, that's within the cutting of it, the betzia. He says, I don't think so. He says, I think it's really in the fact that we're being kovei seuda on lechem mishnah and we're eating from it, right? So when we sit down to eat, we're being kovei seuda, we're doing it on lechem mishnah. V'lo betzia taya milsa. And it's not on, the lechem mishnah isn't contingent on the cutting itself. Ela ba'achila. It's about the eating. So kaya mitzvah zu. And he says that when you eat from, there's lechem mishnah in front of you or in front of the person cutting, making the bracha. That's and then but you as a whole group are being kovei seuda with that lechem mishnah. That's how you're mekayim the mitzvah of lechem mishnah. V'lo naktu betzia elamishum dahavi hechsher achila. And he says, so why is it? He has to answer now. But what about, we have the Shulchan Aruch Harav, we have the Chai Adam. I mean, these are powerful voices who are saying it's about the betzia. What do you do with that? So Rav Asher Weiss says, I think the reason why they're using the language of betzia, of cutting, is because that's the hechsher, that's the preparatory step before you can eat. Before you eat, you have to cut it. So that's, in other words, it's really just the language that they're using. It's lav davka that the mitzvah is within the cutting itself. Ulechein poris balabais melachmo lechol bnei abayis v'kulam ochlim melechem misha sherosh abayis botzelav. Therefore, right, the balabais will cut, and then hand out slices. But bekach niskayma mitzvah dekulam kavu sudasem al lechem mishnah de balabais, and that's how everyone else is being mekayim the mitzvah, is because the balabais cuts it on the 2 loaves and hands out pieces. He says, V'derech zu, this idea that it's really about the seuda and not just about the cutting of it. And we're going to see, the significance of this in a moment. He says, V'derech zu, yeshla beis av b'divrei Tosas psachim kuf vav amud aleph. And he quotes, he says, how do I know this, right? Where's this based on? So he says that this is actually based on a Tosfos in Psachim, where we talk about on Shabbos. He says, so this is talking about the Gemara over there is talking about whether you have to drink from the wine of Kiddush, but the Tosfos also gets into what about the lechem also, making a motzi in the lechem portion of your seuda. Do you have to wait until the person making the blessing, the bracha, eats, or can you eat first? But the Tosfos over there says that you have to wait for the person cutting into the challah to eat before you can, because that person has lechem mishnah and you don't. Because of the lechem mishnah, you have to eat specifically from his bread and not from your own. Meaning that if you had lechem mishnah in front of you, you could also just eat. You don't have to wait. You're just waiting for him because he has the lechem mishnah and you don't. So so his basing it on Tosfos that it sounds like it's really about being kovei seuda with lechem mishnah, and he says v'asi shaper lefi zeh minhag rabim v'tovim shemevorchim al pas ba'atzmam ach kol echad ochel melechem mishnah o shel atzmo o melachmo shel rosh habayis. So he quotes, and I think this is like a Hasidic minhag he mentions above, that there's a Hasidic minhag that everyone at the table makes his own hamotzi. And he says that this works well because they're going to make their own hamotzi, and it's okay that they're making their own hamotzi because either they're eating from the person who's at the table, sitting at the head of the table, who has lechem mishnah, and then eating from that person's, or they're making hamotzi, but they have lechem mishnah in front of them. Either way, it works out just fine because you have lechem mishnah at the table where you're being kovei the seuda. Whereas if you say it's, and this is what he was saying, I don't have this quoted in here, but if you say the opposite, that it's really in the cutting of it, then this minhag, and he says it's a very prevalent minhag in Hasidim. He is a tzanzer Hasid himself. He says that this minhag would be very difficult unless you learn this, that it's really about the seuda itself and not just about the cutting of the challahs. Does that make sense so far? Okay. All right. So he says, now he says, but wait a second here. So he's already answering a question that he hasn't asked. But let's just jump back up to a Rashi, because Rashi doesn't say that. Rashi said, if you remember, here we go. The Gemara said that you have to have lechem mishnah. You have to, and the Gemara says, b'Shabbos chayav adam liftzoa, right? This is where the idea of b'tzia comes from. You have to cut into two loaves because this is lechem mishnah. Rashi says, Livtzoa berchas hamotzi. So from Rashi, it sounds like the mitzvah of lechem mishnah is somehow tied to the bracha of how do I make hamotzi? I can only make hamotzi if I have lechem mishnah. If I don't have lechem mishnah, I'm problematic. Maybe it's b'diavad. Maybe what do I do? But it sounds like lechatchila, when I make berchas hamotzi, I need to have lechem mishnah. It seems to be incorporated into the mitzvah of the bracha itself. So that's what he's going to try and deal with now. Is if we're learning that it's about the seuda and now about the bracha, so what do we do with Rashi? And that's again a powerful voice. It's a Rishon. What do we do with that? So he says, "V'advarim is yashim gam beperish Rashi." Debe'ebes kasha lefarish shitaso. He says the truth is it's actually difficult to understand Rashi. Why? Dechod din lechem mishnah bebracha bilvad talya. He says, well, on the one hand, Rashi becomes difficult because if you're going to tell me that the whole mitzvah of lechem mishnah is in the bracha, and at least going in the direction of the Taz, who said that the mitzvah is deraisa, Ubirchas hamotzi enu element rabbanan. We know that making a bracha before you eat something, that is a rabbinic thing. That's not deraisa that we make hamotzi; it's rabbanan. So ve'ein ne'amar shemitzvah deraisa is tluya bebracha derabanan. So how would we make a mitzvah that's deraisa somehow dependent on a mitzvah that's derabanan? That would be right. That would make a lot of sense. Shizvaod kasha meikar din poris mapu mekadesh denechlaku im mevarach berchas hamotzi da'alohu be'emtza sudaso. All right, so he's quoting another case here that's brought down in the Gemara Psachim, and it's brought lahalacha in Shulchan Aruch. Let me give you a quick background there, and we'll finish on this last piece. Quick background on this halacha is that we're talking about a case where, let's say you started your seuda, you started eating a meal before Shabbos comes in. So you're at the table, you're eating a meal. Shabbos now comes in, so now in the middle of your meal, you have to make kiddush, and I would probably have to make hamotzi, or you have to do something with having lechem mishnah, right? So what do? So he quotes this and says, "Denechlaku imevarach berchas hamotzi." So the question is, do you make hamotzi? Because you've already made hamotzi at the beginning of your seuda, right? That's probably how you started. You started by eating a meal, by washing, saying hamotzi, starting to eat. Shabbos comes in. Do you make another hamotzi when you have lechem mishnah? Like, what do you do now? That's the question. So he says there's a machlokas whether you make hamotzi. Tahalohu be'emtza suda, so it's the middle of your suda. But mechaber hevi as shtei adeos. And the Shulchan Aruch brings in the two different opinions from the Gemara. And the Mishnah Berurah over there says that he says kasav la'alacha eino mevarech hamotzi. So in the Mishnah Berurah paskins, we don't make hamotzi kevin shesafik brachos lahakel, because we're already, so the reason why you might think to make hamotzi is you now have to make kiddush, right? You're in the middle of your meal, Shabbos has come in, I have to stand up now and say kiddush. Has making kiddush now been a hefsek in my original hamotzi that would require me to make a new hamotzi? That's really the question. And so the Mishnah Berurah says, "Safek brachos lahakel." Right? We're not sure. It's that might be a hefsek, maybe it's not, and therefore we say we're making on it. We don't have to make a new hamotzi. So he says, "U'mikol makom nira lechora detzurich livsoa alechem mishnah la'achar kiddush." So this is Rav Asher Weiss saying, but wait a second here. Regardless of whether you're making hamotzi, we would think you're going to need to have lechem mishnah in front of you, after you make kiddush. Ugrula mizu kasav magen Avram lagabe divrei Ramah demisha shachach lekadesh v'nizkar. So sorry, let me just pause there because that was a subtle point that he just made. So what he's saying is that we see that lechem mishnah isn't really about the bracha, because even if, according to the Mishnah Berurah, you wouldn't make hamotzi, but you still need lechem mishnah. So he's just bringing another proof as to why it's not really about the bracha. Lechem mishnah is on the seuda. Seuda's Shabbos requires lechem mishnah. It's not about the bracha that you make of hamotzi. That was a subtle point he's trying to make, is that even in this sort of off, crazy case of starting your meal before Shabbos and then continuing it into Shabbos, where you wouldn't make hamotzi, but you would still need lechem mishnah. Okay, I want to make sure I clarified that because I don't think I was clear the first time. Okay, but he says even more so, even more of a proof, and I know we're just about out of time, but we'll see if maybe we'll just end with this Magen Avram. He says, "L'gabe divrei Ramah demisha shachach lekadesh v'nizkar la'achar berchas hamotzi." What happens if you forget to make kiddush and you don't remember until you say hamotzi lechem min haaretz? You say, "Oh, I didn't say kiddush." And now what do? So the af im tzarich lahavi lo lechem mishnah in ze hefsek lo yochal ad sheviu lechem mishnah. Over there, the Magen Avram says, what do? And he's talking about a case where you don't have lechem mishnah in front of you. You can even go and bring lechem mishnah to you, and therefore, and that's not a hefsek. So you didn't make the bracha. You said Amotzi lechem min aretz. You didn't even have the lechem mishnah in front of you. The Magen Avram says, go bring the other loaf. You now have lechem mishnah and continue forward. So you didn't make the bracha on lechem mishnah because the lechem mishnah wasn't brought until later. So that's the raya. Again, he's bringing from the Magen Avram that the idea of lechem mishnah is really about the seuda, being kovea seuda on lechem mishnah, and it's not about the bracha. It's not about the cutting. He'll see. Maybe we'll try to continue this later. But that's the direction that Rav Asher Weiss is taking, is that this is really it is a rabbinic decree, but it's all about being kovea seuda on lechem mishnah. So we'll stop here.
Jeff, something that never made sense to me.
Yeah.
If the lechem mishnah started by a double portion of mun on Friday,
yeah,
it was because there wasn't going to be a delivery of mun on Shabbos.
Right.
So it makes sense to have 2 loaves on Friday night, but why do you need 2 loaves on Shabbos morning or Shabbos noon? You should only have 1.
Right. A good question. Or by Shalashudas. Yeah. Right. So there's a Mishnah Brura. I didn't bring it in here, but there's a Mishnah Brura that talks about by Shalashudas that says that if you look at the measurement of the Shnei Omer, that it actually comes out that you've got the equivalent of 4 loaves within that measurement. So it's not about it's about how much bread, because these aren't loaves of, the mun wasn't loaves of bread. So it wasn't that you have 2, it's that you have 2 portions that really equate to having 4 equivalent volume, I guess, of 4 loaves. And so you'd have 2, you'd have lechem mishnah for Friday night, lechem mishnah for Shabbos morning. And then the question is, well, wait a second, what do I need for Shalashudas? And that's why that Mishnah Brura is bringing it in. But that's the idea, is that's where it comes from, is it's the measurement as opposed to like the loaves themselves, because mun wasn't bread. Does that make sense?
Yes.
Okay.